Night glam, shining bright, colors dance in the night. You don't owe him a thing, it's not up for debate.
Is that right?
Hey everybody. I've got so much to talk about today. Hopefully you can hear me okay because I have my new mic on. Yeah, I can hear me. Oh my gosh. This mic is awesome. I literally opened it and plugged it in. So that is so great that I was able to do that because I didn't want to have so many things. Because that other one, you know, my sound kept going in and out. This one should be way better. So I have been diving into this document here. And I had some thoughts and I wanted to share them with everybody because, oh, I got to put my speculation banner on. This is all speculation. But I think it's important to parse out though, you know, and if, you know, after we like kind of talk through it and discuss it, if we can just rule it out at that point, then that would be great too. So what I want to do, I don't want to read this whole thing because, you know, like in the beginning, it's like, I think, what is it? Brett. I don't think I need Brett. And I don't want to read all of Nolan's experience. So I do want to start here though, because when Anne asks Brett, you know, when did you first become aware of Brian? And I think he says December 19th. But he also says the FBI didn't tell him that it was necessarily Brian Kohberger's DNA that the FBI had developed. Okay. So in the beginning, she's talking about male B and male D, which I think what the stair rail is male B and male D is the one that's outside. But then we're going to Pennsylvania. So in Pennsylvania, they had male E. And I think if you were on the live with Miss Potts, I think we were all kind of in the conclusion that that could have been Brian's father, Mr. Kohberger. Michael Kohberger, is that his name? Okay. I think Rylene is next. Here she is. Okay, so Rylene is going through her credentials. All right, so here is the first question, which I think is very important for Anne to ask. She says, I want to start with the first part of it. You mentioned, I think, there's standards and protocols. That's going to be key. When I'm talking through this, I'm going to try to explain this the best way that I can. You know, I am still learning about a lot of this stuff too. My specialty is the transfer or trace DNA. That stuff I can talk about all day, but I don't know all areas of DNA. So for this one, I had to do a bunch of reading. And from what I understand, I think there's something wrong here. And so if you guys know any of the answers as I'm going through here, please put those in the chat. Okay, so now she's gonna ask her what the SNP is. No, Riley Nolan does know what that is. And now she's explaining CODIS and how that works. All right, I think I'll start here. I'm going to read a little bit, and I'm going to point out some things that she says and some things that Matthew Gamete says. Okay, so did you become involved in the homicide in Moscow from 2022? Nolan, involved as the manager of the laboratory in Meridian. I haven't actually done any work on evidence in the case or issued any reports. Anne, all right, is it fair to say you did not go to that residence then? Nolan, correct. Anne, as the lab manager, do you understand about the evidence has come into the lab for that case? Nolan, there was a lot of evidence submitted. I have a general knowledge of items that have come in, but I could not provide you a detailed list off the top of my head. And that's okay. I won't ask you to. Nolan, thank you. And as a lab manager, are you aware different bits of testing that were done related to this case? Nolan, in general, yes. And are you aware of a profile called Unknown Male A? Nolan, yes. And where did that come from? Nolan, to my recollection, Unknown Male A came from a swab taken from a knife sheath that was submitted by Moscow Police Department. And are you aware of Unknown Male B? Nolan, I believe that was another sample from hearing the previous testimony that was from in the house. And I would only want you to testify from your own base of knowledge. Nolan, from my memory, I don't recall exactly where B was from. And fair enough. Thank you for clarifying that. Are you aware that investigative genetic genealogy or forensic investigative genetic genealogy was used in this case? Nolan says yes. And what was your role in that? Nolan, my role specific to this case was to facilitate the signing of the memorandum of understanding, making sure all parties received it and had signed it. Those parties being the police agency, the prosecuting attorney's office, as well as a member of the ISP's management team. And when the preliminary report was received, my job was to look over it, ensure that it had all required pieces in the report, and then to authorize payment of invoice for that testing. So Anne just asked her, how did you initiate contact with the SNP? Nolan wrote up the understanding of memorandum for the police agency, the prosecuting attorney, and the ISP. Okay, so they are all in one group there. Anne goes on to say, what role did you have with the laboratory that was going to perform the FIGG work? Nolan, as far as how we came to be in contract with them, so when ISP decided to pursue a contract with the laboratory that could perform the SMP testing that we talked about earlier, we're a state agency, so we don't get to just call up anybody and hire them. So we had to go through a bid process. So part of my role was developing the scope of work for that invitation to bid, as in what we expected the vendor to perform. And then the bids came in. Okay, so she wrote it up, or I don't know how she gets her policies in place, but she said, I need this done. And these, I guess these private labs that they wanted to contract with, you know, they would say, yes, I can provide this, I can provide that. So she already has what she wants them to do. And did Idaho State Police Forensics have a contract with this laboratory or Nolan? They were the winning bid through that process. And so they were under contract with the Department of Purchasing, correct? Okay, so now they're signing stuff together. And is the contract with the Department of Purchasing that you performed these services and we pay you for them, essentially? Or does it have more meat to it to talk about some of the things that you were talking about, how you helped develop, I guess, the job description and what would be required? Nolan, I am really not familiar with the Department of Purchasing's day-to-day operations or how they operate. My role was strictly developing that scope of work. We expect them to develop the profiles that can be uploaded to the public genealogy databases. But we expect the report to contain certain things to have a header, to have a date, to list the case number, have the page numbers, those kinds of things. And outside that description of the scope of work and the requirements, did your lab have a separate contract with Ortham that basically said you agreed to do these things? No, we had that. They won the bid from the Division of Purchasing, and that's the state's contract for performing that work. And you mentioned a memorandum of understanding you helped facilitate to be signed by the parties. Was Ortham on one of those parties that signed that? No. This is a memorandum between law enforcement agencies, the prosecuting attorney's office, and the laboratory. And in the memorandum of understanding, that indicated that the interim Department of Justice interim policy applied. Is that right? I believe it did. And Nolan continues to say, I don't have the exact text memorized. And if I showed you a copy of that memorandum of understanding, would that help you remember? That was a part of it. Nolan, yes. And okay, so then she goes to Hippler. And she's asking her about the Department of Justice because they also have policies in place. Okay. I don't know if D19 is important. I think that actually might be. And so we're going down here. And so now they're going to talk about the Department of Justice interim policy for forensic genetic genealogy, DNA analysis, and searching. Okay, so let's get a little bit further down here because I think we have that understanding of what that communication is going to look like. They're going to assign some things, and they have protocols from not only the Department of Justice, they have them from law enforcement as well. And then they just have, like general practices. Okay. So then Anne is getting Nolan to walk her through the process. And so what's happening is Nolan is explaining what she knows the operations to be. And so Anne is getting her on record pretty much saying that she understands the policies and standard operation procedures. All right. Okay, here we go. And what role did you have to play? Did you have in deciding anything about that trash pool? Nolan, nothing about the trash pool occurring. I do recall there being a brief, I can't remember, it was a phone meeting or a video meeting, just being asked in general, what terms from someone's trash are good for DNA. And did you give advice? Nolan, I don't know if it was me specifically or another member of our DNA unit, but we did offer suggestions on items that are good for DNA. And did you receive items to test? Nolan, yes. And what instructions were you given about those items? Nolan, the discussion was a person of interest had been developed to analyze the items from the trash to determine if they could be inclusive of the DNA profile that was developed from the night sheath unknown male A. So Nolan states on record they were looking for a suspect DNA profile. So that's why they were looking at the trash. And she said that she's going to give recommendations on what, to test for DNA. And says, what date was that you received the trash? The trash was received into the laboratory on December 28th of 2022. And so were you looking for a male profile? Nolan, correct. And all right, did you find male profiles? Plural. Nolan, I didn't perform the actual testing, but yes, there were male profiles developed. And how many? Nolan, I don't know. And do you know anything about either male profile or any of them? Nolan, I believe one of the male profiles designated as E was determined that they could be a biological parent or child of the profile from the night sheet. So yeah, I'll come back and say hi just to see where you guys are. Oh, hello, Dory, welcome. Caroline, Prestige, welcome. Good to see you. Hi, Chic Bait. Great. I'm glad you guys can hear me. And hello, welcome everybody. Okay, so now Nolan just said male E is Michael Koberger, the biological parent. And are you aware that Brian Koberger's DNA was in that trash? Okay, here it comes. Nolan, I was not aware. And did you become aware? Nolan, I became aware later. We didn't have his name at that time. And you didn't know his name on December 28th? Yeah, no, I did not. She might not need his name. She needs that match. And okay, where were you? Were you on December 28th? Were you aware that not male E, but another male profile had been identified? Nolan, from Anne, the trash. Nolan, the trash pool. I knew there were some mixtures of DNA that were also included. And one of the mixtures, did it have a male DNA profile? Nolan, I believe it did. And wasn't that profile the major component of the profile with a minor female? This is going to be huge in a minute. Nolan, I believe that sounds correct. And later, didn't that return to Brian Koberger? Nolan, we actually did not perform that comparison. Ooh, yikes. Okay. And did you and I have a discussion a few days ago? Nolan, we did. And did you tell me that you knew that that to be Brian Koberger's DNA? Nolan, I said I thought that was, and I could not find the report where we had done that comparison. I've since looked through and we did not make that comparison. So I cannot say that he was included in that mixture or the laboratory did not do that comparison. But the DNA profile was made for that mixture. Is that right? Nolan, yes. And And there's a minor female and a major male. No, that is my understanding. And you could, I look at that and tell that's Brian Koberger's DNA, couldn't you? If you wanted to. Nolan. If I wanted to, I could probably look. I did not. And okay, you could still do it today if you wanted to. Nolan. If there was a request to do the comparison, again, we don't do a visual comparison, evidence to evidence. Our procedures don't allow us to do for probative comparisons. Now, this is where I'm getting a little lost. With their specific protocols. Heather Fitzgerald, oh, so good to see you. Hi, Pip Pat. Now, if you guys, you've probably already heard of the term deconvolution. Nolan goes into that and a little later in this as Anne is questioning her. Deconvolution, if you don't know, I'm sure most of you do know, is when you separate the DNA profiles. And from what my understanding is, when you have a major male and a minor female, it is quite common to pull out that major male and you can most likely get a clean profile. Aw, Pip-Pot, he jumped out the window, I looked out the window, aw. So they could have separated that. And their intentions with that trash were probative. Hello, Typically Unique, welcome. And so if your intentions of pulling this trash is probative, and I think this is where they get their likelihood ratios. They may, I'm wondering if it's in the notes, if they would do a likelihood ratio of, is which one of these things is most likely Brian, or is Brian in there? And that the likelihood ratio is a comparison. And I have a huge problem with this likelihood ratio. It's almost like a personal tool that these lab analysts use, like an exercise. And so whoever did this 5.37 octillion is just, in my opinion, very irresponsible. Because from what my understanding was that multiple analysts can look at the same sample and they will all come up with their own likelihood ratio. So it's not some like standard across the board type of thing that you do. And with it, you use non-DNA information and DNA information. So some of the things that they're calculating into this likelihood ratio don't really have anything to do with the sample. It just has to do with these odds and prior odds. And so when you have a capital case, and I know she says it's not touched, but it's low, I believe it is low template DNA. In a capital case, I would be very cautious and never put, like, if I was an expert, which I'm totally not, I would be very cautious and not put the octillion on that. So, all right, so moving on. So we know that they're looking in this trash for something probative. Well, they're looking for Brian's DNA to compare to the source DNA. They're trying to find a suspect profile so they can compare it to unknown male A, because at the time that was allegedly the DNA found on the somewhere on the sheet. All right. So Anne said, okay, well, I also understood that there was a suet butt taken from somebody in connection with the case investigation. Were you familiar with that, Nolan? I am familiar with that, Anne. And that was compared to the DNA on the sheet. Is that right? Is that right? Nolan, yes. Anne. And that was found to be excludable. Am I using that word right, Nolan? It was excluded, correct? And so you compared something that was taken from somebody to an item of evidence Is that right? No. Something that was a secondary reference, as in someone identified it as they saw that person using that item, they saw that person dispose of that item. That item was collected and used as a reference sample from that person because there was someone who said that is from that person. I'm getting lost here again too, because I think that that depends on your standards, your protocols for your lab. But there's always that argument, I think, that everybody has been having. Like, people are like, you don't need a warrant to pull somebody's trash. You know, others are like, yeah, you might actually need a warrant in this case because it's a gated community and there are these rules. And so there was some ambiguity with that. But I think, didn't Hitler just say, you know, no, that was fine. They didn't, you know, need a warrant or anything. And they were, you know, well within their means to be able to do the poll. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think he thought that there was anything wrong with the poll. So in that case, the police didn't need a warrant. According to Hitler, maybe, don't quote me on that, but that hypothetically, let's say that this is what happened. Hitler decides, okay, you don't need that was fine for the trash poll. Okay, so now there is really nothing. They don't, if they don't need a warrant to get this particular trash, they don't need to establish probable cause yet. They can just have it because, you know, the trash pool apparently, you know, those policies in place that, you know, it's curtilage, it's public, whatever. So if Brian Koberger, if there was a sample in that trash, and they didn't need a warrant for it, why wasn't it compared to a sheath and included? Why was it looked over? Did it not match? Did they just not test all the mails in that trash? Because we've established that they didn't need a warrant for that, because Hitler, I don't think he decided that they needed that. So if the lab and Nolan is giving advice on what pieces to test, but Nolan in here, she goes on to say, you know, well, I don't say, you know, test that water bottle or test this or that. So there must be some other criteria that they use to pick the items. But if they are going to, and I think Nolan said they did profile all of those. I think we just read that. So you would think when comparing Brian Koberger's DNA profile that was in the PA trash, it would have been comparable to the source sample from the sheath. They did not need, if in fact that the source data on, or the DNA on the sheath was Brian Koberger's, there would have been a match that day whenever they compared it. They would not have needed to get the paternity test and then go all the way back around to just come back to Brian again. And so that makes me question, if you had a fresh sample from Brian in that trash and it's not computing either by a visual comparison or in their next generation sequencing and those programs that they use, and those numbers aren't matching, they didn't detect for some reason Brian Koberger's DNA profile. And so that, whatever happened there, and I don't know what it was, I don't know if it didn't match, I don't know if it wasn't included or they just didn't test it, whatever those notes need to be in the bench notes so that the defense and, you know, for trial in the record, that it's clear this is what we did with these DNA samples. So I don't know what they wrote about that, but if his profile, like they just didn't connect that the source data goes with Brian Koberger's DNA for whatever reason, why would it go through IgG work and then come back as a stronger match when before it wasn't working. Does anybody see what I'm saying here? Heather says Audrey laughs at the right places. Why? Probably because it's sounding totally ridiculous that things like this are even coming out. Yeah. So, from my understanding, when you have a mixture of a major male and a minor female, those are pretty ideal because you can clearly see the major male from what I've been reading, and they're able to deconvolute that and make it its own. I think at that point it's considered single source. I could be wrong about that, but when they separate them, because it's clearly a major male, and so they do like that, and they prefer that over kinship or paternity testing, parental testing. They prefer that even over the YSTR. The YSTR, from what I'm understanding, is secondary. Like if you have that major male, minor female reference, that's the golden standard. That's what you want. Danielson, welcome. He said the entire procedure is by design meant to result in some kind of positive ID, preferably one that benefits. Yeah, but when they actually compared Brian Koberger's DNA to the source sample, what happened? In reality, they didn't need to do IgG if Brian was the source, unless there is a very well explained explanation in the lab notes of whatever happened to that. I'll tell you what it is here. They call it 9.5.6. No, 95.6. What is going on here? I think I put it on my title. Because it's unlikely that if, well, for whatever reason, they overlooked Brian's DNA profile because for whatever reason, it just didn't compute with the source data found on the sheath. Why would it then, when it goes through all of this stuff where they build it up and whatever they did to it, and even Ortham only got a partial tree. So in reality, it wouldn't have come back to be stronger match to Brian, right? Because they got it directly from him, from the trash. Okay, I was right. I don't know why this isn't popping up. Oh, I got it now. 95.9.1. Here, okay, so there's 4 of these in here. So the first one here, Anne says, okay, did you tell me though, on that sample, and I'm talking about 95.91. I do, for side note, I do believe that is what they labeled either the major male or the minor female, or if they did do any deconvolution, that could be just that's the single male there. But whatever, it's one of those. And this is why Anne is saying that, because typically the gold standard, what you want is that major male, minor female. You want that. So Anne is trying to find out, what are your protocols? Why would you not do these steps in the right order? Why would you look over Brian Koberger's? Why wasn't it compared to the source on the sheath? Okay, so here we go. And okay, did you tell me though, on that sample, and I'm talking about 95.9, one, which Anne will get into later that this is Brian, that was a male and a female. Nolan, I believe that. I don't know if it was designated as that in the laboratory report. To my knowledge, it was. I can't remember what the report said. Again, I didn't generate the report and I didn't do the work. So I'm not as familiar with it as if it was my own work. And okay, male B was also a mixture, wasn't it? Nolan, I don't know. And okay, Nolan, if it was designated as unknown male B, again, I don't know if it was from a mixture, a mixed sample or not. Okay, and then Anne asked the judge for a moment. Okay, Anne says, just a couple of other questions for you. As it relates to male E, and this is Michael Koberger, Brian's dad. I think they said that earlier in here, and I think that's what we all figured on Miss Potts as well. She has a great video. She goes through this too. It is very important that you listen to that one too, because there's so much information that you get from that, listening to her read that. So Anne says, male E profile was compared to a lot of other items in the case, wasn't it? Anne, correct. Or Nolan said correct. And you are allowed to do a manual interpretation per your policy, right? Nolan, if there is, so it's not black and white. So if it's a single source, we can look at it and say that is the person, that person is excluded. They are not the source of the DNA. Then yes, then it can be done manually. And by manual, I mean a person looking at it. And I'm getting lost here too with these procedures, because if you are looking at trash for probative reasons, because you believe that your suspect DNA is in that trash, you're gonna want to, if you're not gonna do a manual comparison, you're gonna want to deconvolute that. You're gonna want to separate the two so you can do your next generation sequencing. That's the whole point, that you looked in the trash. Okay. Okay, no one goes on to say, if it, oh, here we go. If it is a probative comparison, and how we define a probative comparison is if it's saying something about who could be the source of the DNA on an item of evidence that's relevant to the case, then no, we do not do a manual comparison and issue a statement about that, because all of our standards, we have to issue a statistic so that the trier of fact has something to gauge how unique that could be. What is likely, okay, so what is the likelihood that that DNA could be from someone else, right? So there should have been a probative likelihood associated with that mixture. Right? This is from what I'm understanding, and that should have been in the notes. Nolan goes on to say, we provide that statistic. We don't just say it matches. Okay, Nolan. Nolan goes on to say, that requires a statistical calculation, which we use a probabilistic genotyping software to do. All right. And I apologize. I think I got lost in there. Are you telling me because it was a mix, you couldn't have done a manual interpretation? Nolan, because it's a mixed profile, and because if it was, you're saying it was Brian's DNA. Brian Goldberger's DNA was present. That would be like a probative comparison in the case, which we have to provide a statistic in order to make that statement. And why wouldn't you have? That was the whole reason to get the trash. So, like, where's your likelihood ratio? Yes, I mean, if I'm understanding, this is a protocol. So, yeah, we would have to do that. Okay, well then you should have done that. All right, Nolan goes on to say, we have to provide a statistic to make that statement. And you should have. In order to deconvolute a mixture, we are no longer allowed to do this manual deconvolute, as in separate the mixture into its components. We have a software. That software was not designed for, nor was it validated for doing evidence-to-evidence comparisons. See, I'm not really understanding what she's saying there, because you're looking at the trash to see if Brian matches the sheet. So that piece of trash is going to be found and is going to be processed. I just don't know what their protocol is for that. So, Anne, now you're speaking my language. Validations are important for integrity. Is that right? No. In forensics, our laboratory uses validations to ensure any new tool is working properly. And now, at some point later, your lab issued a report saying, matching the DNA on the sheath with DNA taken from Brian Kohlberger. Is that right? Nolan, that's correct. And a statistic was provided. And now, I want to talk about what we're talking about when we say the sheath. Are you familiar with what happened with the sheath for swabbing? Is that right? Nolan, I've seen the sheath and I know how our laboratory performs swabbing of evidence, but I did not swab that item of evidence, nor did I see it being swabbed. And as I understand it, though, you've read the lab notes. Nolan, at one point, I believe I did read the notes. I think I was asked a question and the analyst was out of town or something. And I think you answered that question to law enforcement after consulting somebody else who was the swabber when the sheath was swabbed. Is that right? Melon, this sounds familiar. Yeah, if I understand the lab reports, it's a single source on the sheet, on the night sheet. Is that right? Nolan, correct. And does that mean it's only one person in that area? Nolan, yes, that was detected through our testing. And tell me where you were, where you think that sheath was swabbed for purposes of DNA collection. Nolan, I believe the analyst swabbed there's kind of a snap or a button that was on the top of the snap, and that's the area that was swabbed. There were other areas on it sampled as well. I believe when she says sampled versus swabbed, I think that could be serology testing. Don't quote me on that though, but I think they did the serology testing on the blood on the night sheet. But they did not do any serology testing for the actual unknown male A profile. Okay. And for the purposes of unknown male A that you're telling us later came back to Brian Kohlberger, that's the only place I want to talk about right now. And we are on top of the button, the side, or on the inside, the socket portion of the button. Nolan, I know on the top. I don't recall if she swabbed the underside or not. I have to look at her notes again. And do you know if that sheath was a part of that preserved for fingerprinting? Nolan, the swabbing was done first, so that's our laboratory standard of processing. If DNA is needed in fingerprints, they will work together. Essentially, fingerprints will say we can see some possible ridge detail. So if you can avoid this area after DNA says we want to swab this, and they come to a decision of what would be best suit that item of evidence to determine where to swab. So the swabbing takes place first. Okay. Swabbing would have been done first. And I think I don't have any other questions right now. Thank you. Okay, so Nye is going to get up and cross-examine. Okay, we'll read a little bit of this because Nye gives a little later on in the. He gives a little hint, I think. Nye, good morning. So you talked a little bit about policies and procedures in the lab. Do you recall that testimony? Nolan, yes. Nye, and you talked about that there are policies and procedures related specifically to DNA. Is that correct? We want to know the order you did stuff and what kept you from comparing Brian Koberger's actual DNA to the actual source DNA before you went around the world and created who knows what in a SNP. As a part of those policies and procedures, does the lab need to have a legitimate reason to test DNA? Nolan, yes. We only test DNA related to criminal investigations or to death investigations, and it needs to be an item that will answer a probative question in the case. The biggest probative question in the case is, does Brian Koberger's DNA from his trash, while you're in PA, is it included, excluded, inconclusive? Why wasn't there a result given? Where are the notes? Okay, so 9. So, for example, if someone at the lab wanted to test DNA out of curiosity about medical information, that would not be consistent with the policy. Okay, so I get involved with this medical stuff. I don't know, I think that's guilty knowledge. They probably did. But, all right, let me see here. Okay. Okay, so now you also testified that you were involved in or maybe primarily responsible for developing the scope of work requested for Ortham. Is that correct? Nolan, I was part of that, yes. Now, and what is the scope of that work? Nolan, that just goes with, and this was my first one I've done, so I don't have vast experience in this process, but when you're going to contract with a vendor, just going through and outlining what we expect them to do as part of that. 9, what do you recall about this request specifically? What were you requesting Ortham to do? Nolan, specifically, we were requesting them, if necessary, to perform DNA extraction, pulling the DNA out of cells on an item of evidence. If necessary, our laboratory typically did that. We were requesting them to generate a SNP profile using either SNP array or whole genome sequencing. We were requesting them to then upload it to all the public databases that allow law enforcement samples. We were requesting them to generate a report. We were requesting them to notify us or to complete the lab portion of the work. Generation of the profile within 60 days, I believe. I believe there was also information in there about not publicly giving our case information to the public without our express permission, things of that nature. 9. Was there anything in the scope of work requested related to medical information? No. 9. So you weren't asking Ortham to determine if the DNA, the person whose DNA this was, had, for example, cancer? No. All right, I'm going to skip down a little bit here because all right. All right, so Nye says, and the FBI was not a party to that memorandum, correct? In another part of your testimony, you spoke with Ms. Taylor about the trash pool. Do you recall that testimony, Nolan? Yes, Nye. And that one of the samples that was pulled from the trash was a mixed sample. Your lab did not compare that, is that correct? Nolan, correct. Nye. And can you explain why you did not compare that? That, how can that happen in an investigation? I just don't understand. If that is your guy, why wouldn't you test the male profiles in that trash? That's why you're there. The whole reason is to get Brian Koberger's DNA next to the Sheets DNA. What does that mean when they missed an opportunity? I don't know. Okay, Nolan. So initially we did not compare that. Initially, so they did eventually compare. Okay, Nolan. So initially we did not compare that because it was a mixed profile. I don't know. I'm lost with that again. Why would that ever be their protocol when I think the gold standard is okay? Major male, minor female is good and it's preferable over paternity tests, over YSTR testing. The autosomal DNA testing from a major male, minor female is like the ideal conditions. It's what from what I read, but I could be wrong as well. So initially we did not, Nolan says, we initially did not compare that because it was a mixed profile. We did not know the source of that profile. So it could not be considered as a secondary reference. What? So it could not be considered as a secondary reference, so we deem that to be an evidentiary sample. I think that goes into the background data, and so background data is, never mind. Okay, let's think about something else. And we can't make a manual comparison of evidence to evidence, especially when it's a mixture. And if the analyst, again, I was not the analyst, if the analyst did the comparison and determined the unknown male A could have been in the mixture, it would have been inappropriate to compare the two samples together per analytical methods. I don't get that. Why wouldn't you isolate a major male profile from the trash of your suspect? That this doesn't make sense to me. Okay, 9. So the decision not to compare that, who made that decision? Nolan. That would have been the analyst that did that worked the case. Oh, 9. So you weren't, to your knowledge, no one at the lab was advised, for example, by the lead investigator on this case, which of those items to test? No. 9. You also gave some testimony about the knife sheath and swabs on the knife sheath. Do you recall that? No, yes. 9. And I know you don't recall exactly where the knife sheath was swabbed, but we've been talking about policies. Do your policies or best practices suggest where a knife sheath or an item like that should be swabbed for DNA? Now, side note, I think I'm recalling, I think very early on, oh, to die for, welcome, Dinky, Cheap Bait. Oh, good to see you guys. So I think I'm remembering from very early on, one of my first videos, I think, I was reading about the expert working group, and I do believe that they try to recommend best places to swab. So I don't know if Nolan's particular lab follows, not necessarily what the expert working group suggests, But maybe there's some protocols out there that are slightly more standard, like maybe more labs use it than not. But these labs sometimes are very fragmented, and sometimes they all have different standards. And so I was reading an article before, I think it was like from the Alabama State Bar or something, where um, even in the same laboratory, DNA analysts can come to different conclusions. So they'll test the same sample and they can be different. I don't know if that has to do with that likelihood ratio, because that likelihood ratio, it's like you're putting like, I guess you can call it scientific data, but it's not like the DNA data. But every lab has, every analyst has their own personal thing. So no wonder they all come to different conclusions, because they're all using different criteria, maybe with their likelihood ratio. I don't know. I don't know exactly how that works. But from my understanding, this is how it goes. All right. No, Nolan. No, it would be impossible for our analytical methods to cover how to swab or where to swab every single item of evidence. So we received quite a variety of items in the laboratory. So it's the analyst's job as a scientist, as a practitioner in forensic biology screening and DNA analysis, to know what they're targeting. You have a knife sheath. What other items were collected from this scene that was like that? I think even if, they, maybe the lab analysts, I don't know if they know the significance of items, but I do feel like they do some sort of triage. I mean, they have to know, maybe they don't know everything, but they do know how to triage, I guess, in the order in which they believe might be important. And I feel like if there's a weapon thing, even if like, you know, even if it was, determined that it was already at the house, maybe a victim used it as self-defense, even if it was on, that type of thought process or even description, I think they would still triage that somewhere. So I mean, if you think that the sheath is your star weapon, and so yeah, I think there should have been conversations about where to swab that. I don't understand what Nolan is talking about here. Okay. Nolan goes on to say, so on this item, I believe there was also blood. Blood, okay, so that, yeah. Sorry, I saw something. All right, a bug. There's a bug over there. Um, so they would have been targeting that separate and then also trying to determine who may have handled that. So they would have specifically honed in on the area that whoever handled it would have had to have touched, and maybe touched separately. Hold on, I just had, there was an example. I'm gonna move over there now. It's completely relevant to what she's just saying. Okay, so it was, what was it? It's the what's the silo effect? Um, ah, okay, it was Australia. I thought it was in here. Right, it's not in our famous report. I gotta look it up. They had a big study going on in Australia about what they call a silo effect in a forensics lab. Okay, here's what this AI generally says. The silo effect in a forensic lab refers to the lack of communication and collaboration between different departments or teams within the lab, leading to inefficient sharing and potentially hindering the investigation process. That can occur when specialized sections like DNA analysis or ballistics operate independently without the integrating of their findings with the areas like crime scene processing or digital forensics. Definition. The justice silo effect, also called the silo effect, describes a situation where different organizations like law enforcement and forensic labs operate in isolation with minimal to no interaction. This isolation can lead to communication breakdowns, interpretations of evidence, and ultimately unjust outcomes. Several factors can contribute to the silo effect, including multidisciplinary scientific services. Forensics labs often involve multiple specialties: DNA, ballistics, digital forensics, each with its own expertise and processes. Multi-organizational practitioners, forensic investigators may involve a collaboration between different law enforcement agencies, forensic labs, and even medical examiner's office, which with its own organization, structure, and procedures. Okay, increased reliance on scientific services. A forensic science becomes more complex and critical in investigations. The need for effective communication, information sharing between departments becomes even more critical. All right, so here, consequences. The silo effect can have several negative consequences. Miscommunication, lost information, lack of communication can lead to misunderstandings, duplication of effort, and missed opportunities to connect evidence from different sources. Inefficient resource utilization. Departments may duplicate efforts or waste resources if they are not aware of the work being done by others. Reduce overall efficiency. The silo effect can investigations and hinder the ability to solve cases effectively. Potential for errors and delay. Miscommunication and lack of coordination can lead to mistakes in the investigation process and delays in obtaining results. So even though Nolan is on the stand saying that, she would work together, like her DNA team, they call it the DNA department, and then they would kind of work together with the fingerprint department. But was there really communication there? I don't know. I guess we'll find out. But as soon as I heard, I'm reading this again, and every time I read this, I get a little bit more information about it. So as I was reading that part, the silo effect just popped into my head, and I was like, huh. And it almost sounds like it when she's on the stage. She doesn't know what the actual analyst did. So even if she is trying to be evasive, like pain, it can also come across as your lab is inefficient. Look, they have these things of dismantling the justice silos flowchart. What is this? Let's look at this real quick, and then we'll go back. Okay, that's where I'm gonna go. Yeah, I mean, what else can we attribute to them missing it? That's a huge step in the investigation. I mean, I think I don't know, that's terrible. There's a flow chart of the role of expert of forensic science, forensic medicine. I thought there would be like a chart. All right, never mind. We're gonna go back and read that. Just popped in my head. We can keep that as a possibility. Maybe as our discussion kind of goes forward, maybe we'll work it out where that's not a thing. But that just popped in my head. Okay, so I'm trying to look. Where's the page I was on? Yeah. Okay, so Nolan says, no, it would be impossible for our analytical methods to cover how to swab or where to swab every single item of evidence. So we receive quite a wide variety of items into a laboratory. So it's the analyst's job as a scientist and as a practitioner in forensic biology screening and DNA analysis to know what they're targeting. So on this item, I believe there was also blood. So they would have been targeting that separate And then also trying to determine who may have handled that. So they would have specifically honed in on the area that whoever handled it would have had to have touched and maybe touched repeatedly. Like, where are these people from? Like, okay, there probably should be like a loose um, protocol for where you would triage something like that. And two, uh, where are the case relevant things to indicate was that a defense weapon? Was that offensive a weapon? And I don't know. I would think the easier answer is it was left there because it doesn't belong to the perpetrator, right? The perpetrator doesn't care about that. I don't know. All right, we're moving on. 9. And why do they hone in on those areas in particular? Nolan, because that's the question we are trying to answer. In the forensic DNA analysis, the questions we're trying to answer is, can we link assailant to victim, victim to assailant, or one or both to the scene? So in this instance, my understanding, the sheath was found at the scene. So trying to link the possible perpetrator to the scene. So she knows she was at that was it the Forensics Academy, American Academy, where they had their big yearly event, where one of the main topics was, don't speculate on the how and the when. I mean, that was like highlighted. Even though she says people disagreed with it, I don't know. I don't know where those people are. She should probably try to find them. But she she should know better that yes, this sheath is a movable object. So in the triage, I would think that that might be high on the triage, but those blood samples, I would want those to be higher. And so when she's saying here who would have handled it, I don't know. Are they like, oh, Daddy came, welcome? Well, now we know that this type of thinking can lead to mistakes because she's not triaging properly. And for whatever reason, her lab missed Brian Koberger's DNA directly matching the source. Who knows what they did to actually build it up. And actually, I think that the way that this happened actually points more to they went down the wrong path of the family tree. Because if Brian didn't really match or whatever happened, they didn't even test it. I don't know. Like, what? I don't know. I guess a clear explanation should be written in their notes. All right. 9. And why in particular do you hone in on the areas where this person may have handled the knife sheath? She like pretends it's like a knife. They all pretend it's like a knife. That could be where mistakes come in too. Yeah. Nolan says, because looking for, so DNA is found in the cells in our body, and that includes the skin cells. She didn't do serology testing, so she doesn't even know. Includes skin cells that are sloughed off on our hands when items are handled. So looking for any touch DNA is the term that is most often used. No, that's why everybody puts it in quotes, because it's like, we don't want to use this, but for describing purposes, sometimes they use it. But if you notice, the majority of the time when you're reading articles are in quotes, because people don't really like to use it, but for whatever reason it is used. I was always taught never to use it because it's not accurate. But anyway, most often used or from someone touching or handling the item. 9. So if I'm understanding correctly, the analyst is swabbing the places that would most likely have that touch DNA. Nolan, correct. Is that like elementary thinking? Because like we in like society, like the basic principles surrounding thinking about a situation where a movable item could have the probative action and the alternative action. Those things are occurring and they could be equally true because that possibility does exist that an alternative action had occurred even though a DNA profile is present. That is just logic. It's not like the world goes where it only happens if DNA is at the scene. That's it. You're done. No, no, no. Like, just a basic principle would be like, okay, it exists. That option exists. That there's an alternative activity. And as we're finding out with more research, that is actually becoming a very high probability with these movable objects and this trace low template DNA. Because our technology has gotten so sensitive, you're looking at things that we weren't able to see before. And so that there's a whole lot of other occurrences, a whole lot of other things to consider, a whole lot more activity. You know, when you expand like that, you're going to have more possibilities come in. That's just, you know, the nature of being able to do that. And so you cast a wider net of possibilities. So you would have to consider an alternative activity when there's a DNA profile present, because that's how it works when you get into these um when you, it's just you get into these more powerful types of tools. You know, they're asking and answering more questions, and so you're going to have more propositions like that. Okay, so here comes Anne. She's coming back. She's going to redirect. All right, here we go. Anne, we were talking at the end of my questions and where Mr. Knight just left off with you about where the sheath would have been swabbed. Reading the email that's been placed in front of you, does that refresh your recollection about what you believed to be the place the sheath was swabbed? Nolan, very much so. And where was it swabbed? Nolan, the knife was swabbed the entire, can I, Hitler, did you just say the knife was swabbed? Sorry, the knife sheath. Am I allowed to read it? And you're supposed to read it and then let it refresh your recollection and then not read it, but just tell me a summary of where it was. Nolan, the entire leather portion of the strap, both top and bottom, and the underside of the button. Oh my gosh, okay, so Nolan is, sorry, she's reading an email, some type of communication. I don't know, did it say it was her email? I don't know whose email it was, but it was an email that she either saw, she maybe saw some communications going on. And so now she's reading and she's confirming that she's looking at a document. And in that document, it says the sheath was swabbed on the leather portion of the strap, the top and the bottom. I don't know if that's like the top of the handle and then the bottom of the point, or like, okay, yeah, that would be it, because the leather portion would be all of it. And then you have the top and the bottom. Okay. And then the underside of the button. Okay, so on the other underside of the button is in that email. Nolan goes on to say, I misspoke. She did not swab the top of the button because that was determined to be the most likely place for fingerprints to be found. Okay, and the underside of the button Was that in the part that the sticky outy part would go in, or the sticky outy part, or both? No, I can't tell from this. I would have to look at her notes. I just keep thinking silo. This is how mistakes happen. All right, and okay, good enough. Thank you. All right, so okay, here we go. I guess is it Nye again? A couple of follow-up questions for you. You answered a lot of questions about for Mr. Nye. Oh, are we back with Anne? About medical information, that your lab does not do testing for medical information. Is that because you do STR or YSTR testing, not SMP testing? Nolan says, correct. Our laboratory performs both STR and YSTRs, and those didn't yield medical information. Okay, so right here, I think I want to skip down because there's a point here that I want to make it, but Matthew Gamete says it. Isn't gamete like a biology word? And like he went into it. I just keep thinking that. Okay. I think this is gamete here. What page is that? 96. Okay, so let's go up here a little bit. Yeah. Here we go. See, Matthew Gamete. All right, so this is what I want, right? So, okay, so now Anne is saying, or Matthew said, I accompanied the officer from Boise down to Houston and down to Ortham Laboratory. I didn't have possession of the sample, but I was with the investigator that did. And that, okay, sidebar, that also reminds me, this DNA did go around the world, so the chain of custody is questionable. And I would think that the profile that they developed from Michael Koberger would come back, you know, slightly different because of the tests they did to it and how they built it up and those types of things. So it's going to be a very different profile by the time it goes around the world. And you also have that there's a questionable chain of custody. So you have all that nonsense when you could have just tested it. Because his DNA profile was in the trash, and it was highly likely that DNA was in the trash. And now it makes me wonder why those stories are out there, you know, in the media where he was trying to conceal his DNA. No, he wasn't. It was in there. And I wonder if they did that to, you know, make them look a little better because that is gonna, I don't know, that it's devastating that they weren't able to do that. That would have been so crucial to this case. Okay. So, and after the sample was delivered, did you have communication with Ortham further? Yes. Gamete, yes. And what were those? Gamete. So I had communication to my memory with them about the type of analysis we're asking them to do. Also, what type of searching? I remember they asked specifically for consent to do certain types of searching. We had to authorize things through memos and whatnot of them doing certain searching. Specifically, I believe it was family tree DNA. They needed foreign authorization. I remember having a significant discussion with them about YSTR testing and if or how that would be accomplished. And why did you want Ortham to do YSTR testing? So the reason for YSTR testing is to utilize different investigative databases that might be out there. they would have just tested Brian Koberger's DNA. They wouldn't need to do this YSTR testing. Gavin goes on to say, I don't believe in this case we ever did YSTR testing. So not only did they not do the deconvolution of the major male, minor female to triage male DNA profiles from the trash, in which the major male, minor female is the highest. That's like their gold standard. And I don't remember if YSTR is second or third because they have that, paternity test. I guess they went that direction. And so this YSTR is, like second best. And they didn't even do second best. Well, I guess if they did the YSTR testing, they wouldn't be able to tell, I think, between the father and the son. So I think that's why they went with the paternity test, because that gives you a lot more answers, more definitive information. So, but then I'm questioning them making that decision that they would want to go with the paternity test because, it will give you more information. But then why are you having significant discussions about the YSTR? And that also makes me question the amount of the sample. So they obviously wanted to do some preserving because they know they have a certain amount from the sheet. So maybe we'll get a little bit more clues about how much they have. Okay, and what did you want Ortham to do? Why did you want Ortham to do YSTR testing? Gammy. So the reason for YSTR testing is to utilize different investigative databases that might be out there. I don't believe in this case we ever did YSTR testing. A lot of discussion was around preservation of the sample. Okay. Danger Zone! Welcome, Mommy Ball. Oh, Amethyst is here. Welcome, Amethyst. All right, did I miss anybody? Yvonne Poole, Steve W, Kennedy Kane, Cassidy Kane. Sorry, I just have to call you Daddy Kane. I think I got all you guys. I just wanted to make sure that you can see the page. All right. So Gammy goes on. A lot of discussion was around preservation of the sample, or as much of the sample we could preserve. So our recommendation to them was not to proceed with that type of testing at this time. So to kind of see where we were able to go with the traditional SMP testing with the whole genome sequencing, and then we would maybe potentially revisit YSTR testing. Now, I'm not saying that says anything necessarily about the amount, because I know that strategically law enforcement may want to just preserve it in case, because they did preservations with the Golden State Killer too, where they tried to preserve as much as that as possible, because that was what, over span 30 years, I have no idea, but they knew they wanted to save a little bit of it for the future use. So it could have been strategic that they want to preserve everything they have about it, which, it's not blood, sweat, semen, or saliva. With that usually has a lot of information in it, and a lot of genetic material. So whatever genetic material came off of that sheath, obviously it's not as robust as those things, and so they're going to want to preserve it. However, there could still be enough to do these testing, but even then, once you break it up, because the Moscow PD or the Idaho State Lab, they consumed some of it to do, I think, the autosomal STR, or whatever they were doing to it, they consumed a little of it. And then these SMPs, that takes a significant more than the autosomal. And so did they even have enough to do that? I guess they did. Middle Middleman, I guess he did his best to try to clear up whatever sample they had. And he, in the documents, he was only able to get a partial tree that led to 4 brothers, but he needed more information to go forward. So whatever, maybe there was enough of it that it could have gone with this SNP. But then I don't think that there was enough left for the defense to test. So however, how much they have is definitely on their mind because it's limited, but we just don't know exactly how much. And they have not provided us with the value. They've given us the other one, the concentration, but we still don't know. So we got to look out for that too. Okay. So Gammon goes on to say, I do remember some discussion with David Middleman at Ortham if they were able to bootstrap some of the whole genome sequencing in order to develop a Y profile that could be searchable from the data that they had already developed instead of using additional sample to specifically develop a YSTR profile or any kind of Y profile. Okay, so, Anne, what does that mean? Bootstrapping. Take me back. They have this DNA sample. And then have they done those steps to get to their SNP before you want bootstrapping done? Or at that stage are you talking about? Is Anne is Anne trying to figure out how much it is too? We'll try to figure out someday. Gabby, essentially, it is our understanding that they were in the process of or had already obtained a whole genome, okay? A whole genome sequencing profile. So our question to them was, is there a way to develop a YSTR profile from the genetic information that you already have through the other method of testing? Okay, so at this point, maybe they didn't do the paternity test yet. Maybe that comes later. I think, I'm not sure. Okay, so, and yeah. And that's what you mean by bootstrap? Add a different kind of analysis? Gabby, correct. And why would you want to do that? Gabby, again, to see if there was a potential to search Y databases that might be available out there to identify genetic lineages. And what does that mean? Genetic lineages. Gabby, so a Y chromosome is passed down from father to son. And so we would be looking to see if we can identify a family line through tracking the Y chromosome DNA from father to son to grandfather all the way down to grandson, and potentially over multiple generations. So it would tie us into a family line that could be investigated further. I don't know why, but I could be getting the order wrong in here, but for some reason, I feel like they had his name. They tried to develop it and then go through IgG. I don't know why that's in my head. I may have gotten the order wrong, but I feel like that's what happened. They had his name. Yeah, they had his name. On the 19th. And then on the 28th, they did, the ISP did some lab work, or did they take it down to Ortham then? I'm not sure about the order. Amethyst says, conclusion, this was reverse engineered with a buccal swab. There were several taken at his parents, so did they swab dad just to direct compare, which in effect is a total lie, entire DNA sheath. All right, so get back over here. Just want to check on you guys. Even if I have the order wrong, they still needed that direct comparison because that's stronger in court. Usually, that's what they want. They want that strong connection. So that major male profile would have been really important. So I don't know why they had to do the paternity test. Um, Okay, so genetic lineages. So a Y chromosome is passed down from father to son, and so we will be looking to see if we can identify a family line through tracking the Y chromosome DNA from father to son to grandfather, all the way down to grandson, and potentially over multiple generations. So it would tie us into a family line that could be investigated further. And did Ortham bootstrap and get the YSTR for you? Yummy. To my knowledge, they never did anything with YSTR testing. And in my recollection, my discussions with David, that wasn't possible with the data that he had at that point. And that wasn't possible? Yummy. That it was not possible, correct, and thank you. I wonder why it wasn't. Okay, Gammy, I do not believe that was attempted. Again, I'm not familiar with the technology that he would have had to have used to do such a thing, so I'm not aware if that was possible, if the technology didn't exist. I just don't know. And okay, at some point, did Ortham talk to you about the work they were doing? Gammy, yes. And did they have a recommendation? Gammy, they did. They had at least one recommendation that I remember and says, when was that conversation? Gammy, I don't remember exactly when the conversation happened. And, well, let's put it between, well, when did they get the DNA to start with? Gammy, so they got the DNA November 22nd, I believe. And then they were notified to stop work. Gammy, I believe the official notification was on December 10th, if I remember correctly. Okay, sidebar, if I remember correctly, Stephen Mercer was saying usually they stop all testing because there was, I think, STR match or a match of some kind, then they stop everything. So it just popped into my mind. Did they stop November 10th? Because did they match to something that wasn't Brian? I don't know. That was just a thought I just had. Doesn't mean it's true. It's just something that I thought. Okay, so here we go. And so when they come back to you with some recommendations, where was that in relation to stop work? Gammy, probably early in December. I'm guessing the actual work, the laboratory. What I would call the wet work in the laboratory would be the first couple of weeks, probably before they would have turned it over to the genealogist to be searching in the database and those sorts of things. And to make sure I'm with you, wet work means DNA sample to where we get to the whole genome sequencing and then where we get to a SNP. I know I'm skipping steps, but that's the wet work. Gabby, correct. The laboratory work. So anything that would be done in the physical laboratory. Handling the sample, putting it into tubes, adding liquids, things of that nature that would be done in the laboratory, sequencing on an instrument that would all be done in the first several weeks. Okay. And so after that, they have a recommendation for you. Get me correct. What's the recommendation to you? And get me. The recommendation to my memory, to my recall, was that they had several individuals that had the potential to be of interest in this investigation. They asked us if, to further their DNA tree building, if we could be in contact with individuals and see if they were willing to contribute information to the databases that they were using in order to further the family tree building and further the geological work. And we're in a closed setting here, so I'm going to ask you to give me the last names. Gabby, I don't recall the last name. I'm sorry. And was it your understanding that these were four brothers? Gabby, yes. And okay, what did you do in relation to these four brothers? Gabby, so we did some cursory work, just looking publicly accessible information, literally Google searches and things of that nature. What approach? Oh man, I feel like they have AI now to do that. Some kind of like program where they can put in some stuff and the AI will just collect. You can do that very quickly. What approach was is we didn't want to be approaching people, especially an investigation of this nature that really had nothing to do with anything. We just wanted to make sure there was some reason that Ortham Laboratories was asking us to go and ask these individuals to put their DNA into the database that law enforcement can search. So we just did some work to build just very cursory family trees to see what connection these individuals may have, to verify these individuals were indeed brothers, things of that nature. And did you verify they were four brothers? Gummy, I don't know that we would use the term verify, but we believe that the information was reliable that they had given us on the publicly accessible information. And now I know you said you can't remember the last name of those brothers, but we're here today, and Brian Koberger's name has been on the news for 2 years. You know his name. That wasn't the last name. Gabby. That was not the last name. And after you did the cursory work of the family tree, what was the next thing you did in relation to the four brothers? All right, so that's when they call. Let's get down here a little bit. All this calling, it's not documented. All right, so they had a meeting on December 10th. Okay, that was when they had the stop work. Okay. Okay, this is how wig is that or whatever it is. So then he's just gonna go through and he talks about. All right, I want to get to this last part down here. Where was I reading this? So when you are accredited by these types of things here, this one is ANABISO. They have certain recommendations that you follow because you're accredited. So those would be some of the protocols and procedures that the law enforcement should have done. And so he's talking about that. And then I'm wondering how big of a deal this is that they didn't test. They didn't do a direct comparison with Brian. It was his dad. That, right. I don't want to miss it because I thought it was great. I thought now I slipped a little bit. Okay. All right. So Anne says she wants to make a really good record, which I think she is when she's laying all of these procedures out to see if they were followed properly. Okay, so Hitler says something here. Because he's talking about what they want to talk about publicly, and he goes, I think, frankly, it's appropriate to discuss how law enforcement handled the profiles that they received. I think it's appropriate to talk about whether or not those profiles, what privacy is at issue in those profiles. I think that obviously the state is going to talk about standing and other issues and your client's specific privacy rights with respect to this. So I don't think that's appropriate. So I think we're generally okay staying away from the specifics that I'm not sure that ultimately would be admissible at trial. Even if I were to say, well, admissible at trial, the whole IgG issue, I'm not sure that's going to be admissible at trial. I suspect the search, the trash pull is going to be admissible at trial, that the genealogic match allegedly to Mr. Koberger's father, and the lack of attempt to figure out, I think, what I'm understanding, at least from the testimony, the attempt to figure out how the mixed profiles, so that's all fine. All right, so they're talking about that mixed profile is going to be an issue here. Okay, so here, this is important. Ann Taylor says, okay, we had an affidavit attached to the back, I think, of our reply briefing on the suppression issue. I want to make sure that the court looks at that. That's admissible as evidence, and I probably don't want to refer to that publicly. Would you like my copy? Court, Hitler, what was the date of the filing? And it should have been the 19th, December 19th. Hitler, what was the name of the document? Reply to, object to, and. This was a reply to the state's objection to the motion to suppress IgG material. Hitler, it's not showing on the 19th. Oh, here we go. It was the 20th. What is it you want to reference in the argument with respect to this affidavit? And standing, Your Honor, I don't need to reference that particularly. I just wanted to draw the court's attention to it. the court. In particular, the standing that the affidavit suggests the unknown male E was Mr. Koberger. Is that what I'm reading? And no, there was a sample within the trash that was Mr. Koberger's. Pipler. Okay, I'm not sure the state's arguing that there's no standing as to the trash. I think the standing argument related to the genetic testing through the companies and to the objection to the testing of materials found at the crime scene. Am I correct about that? 9. Your Honor, we did assert in our briefing standing. It was kind of in passing in the sense that we think the fact that the trash pool resolves the issue. Court. I appreciate the trash pool legal issues in terms of privacy standing, but in terms of the standing of this is not Mr. Koberger's DNA, so why am I hearing from him? Standing, which is part of what you argued on the IgG information. 9. Correct. Court. There's that issue. I don't see that impacted here because it sounds like some of his DNA was in that trash. And then there's the standing issue, as I understand it, related to the extent that the defense is not conceding that the DNA found on the knife sheath was Mr. Koberger's. He has no position to object to the testing of the DNA and the knife sheath. The court. I don't see here, frankly, is an argument as to the standing issue of, if not his DNA, as it relates to the trash pool. That's just how I see it. If you think that's different and you need to make that argument, you need to let me know so I know what we're getting into. 9. No, Your Honor, it's not different than that. What had happened was, what happened is, in this opening brief, they asserted there was DNA found in there, including an unidentified male. In response, I said, well, that's not standing. You can't just say an unidentified male. In the reply that they attached this saying, well, we looked at it and it was his. That's sufficient. I don't plan on arguing that point. The court. All right. Are we all square then? And I think so. So it sounds like Anne attached information about that DNA sample that was Brian Koberger's in the trash at the Pennsylvania trash pool. And she was saying this is standing for something. And I was like, you can't just say that. You can't just say it was unidentified. And then she comes back and says, no, we tested it, it is his. So the significance of that, I think, has to go with why they didn't do direct testing, because that is their, or why they missed it. Why didn't they just test Brian's DNA instead of doing this paternity test? So that was my point. But he was in there and he wasn't trying to hide his DNA, like the news said. Oh, there's new docs. All right, let me take a look. Yeah. I've been like scouring these documents already. I'm gonna have to read a lot more. Order on motion eliminate vague and undisclosed expert testimony. Order on defendant's motion to strike the death penalty regarding autism. Order states motion eliminate the text messages in the 911 call. Order sealing the jury instructions. Order sealing witness. Okay, so we have the order on the vague testimony. Oh, I do want to look at that one real quick. I don't know. All right. thank you to IDAHO4 for letting me know. Yeah, I don't know if anybody missed that his DNA was in there, and it could be an issue why they missed it. All right. Let's see. I don't know if we can read that one. I'm very interested in the vague testimony. Oh wait, is there another motion to seal? Motion to seal lay witnesses. Okay. These are really long. I guess you can see here. Is he gonna do this thing where he grants some and not all others? Yeah, so I don't know if I can get into these right now. I am so tired. I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you everybody in chat. Thank you everybody on replay. I guess let's think about why they didn't get his DNA directly to Matt or to compare. When that's the better route to go, my understanding. All right, everybody, have a great night. Thank you for being here. Bye, guys.
Ghost DNA, haunted by the past, echoes of whispers that never quite last. Unknown, but visible and missing bones, just out of reach, like flickering shadows, like a glitch in the code. Jump scares and double takes, but nothing is there, just traces of history caught in the air. Ghost DNA, living in